talking about freedom of speech and particularly the 30 articles of the human rights which Lars Gule has adamantly, vehemently defended in the past, which I maintain are liberal outgrowths. One of them is democracy. One of the human rights is democracy. Now I'll give you a scenario, and I want you to answer this scenario. Would you consider it democratically legitimate if a state were to carry out a referendum and conclude that they want amputation for thieves as an appropriate punishment? And if not, why not?
Thank you.
The answer is no. And that is because of human rights. And the question is very relevant in the West, because we have had since 2001 a so-called war on terror. In that war on terror, the Americans found it reasonable. They tried to justify it through law, arguments, that we can torture suspects in the war on terror. Between 60 and 80% of Americans polled on this question said it was acceptable. It is not acceptable. You have no right to infringe the basic human rights of everyone, even the criminal, with the infliction of torture. That is an absolute prohibition in human rights. Totally unacceptable. So, if you say God has said we should amputate the hand of the thief, that is a clear example of how certain commands in Islam are against human rights and therefore not compatible with modern human rights thinking. Actually, rather few states, including Muslim states, practice this. I think it was Habib Bourguiba it was actually the second in command in Libya under Gaddafi, who had his special interpretation of Islam, and he was criticized for that. But he said it was Islam and they should follow Islam in many ways. And this guy was asked, why don't you amputate the hand of the thief? He said, no, we can't have a stock of laborers with only one hand. We need people who can work with both hands, which is a rational way of saying that it is a completely outdated method of punishment for rational reasons. But the main fact is that it is a cruel and inhumane punishment, and therefore it should not be practiced.
The premise that barbarity equals falsity, because we heard he says something about cutting the hands off. He says it's barbaric, cruel, and barbaric. I think that's right. Cruel and inhumane. That's the words he used. But just because something is cruel, it doesn't mean it's false. That's a fallacy, actually. That is a fallacious kind of reasoning. Barbarity does not equal falsity. And in fact, war is an industry of barbarity and cruelty. War is an industry of barbarity and cruelty. And unless you're a pacifist, you endorse that kind of barbarity and that kind of cruelty. You actually went and tried to get involved in it yourself. I mean, so who gets to decide which kind of barbarity and cruelty is legitimate and which kind of barbarity and cruelty is illegitimate? And moreover, another thing is here, we talked about the vote, If a Muslim country, for example, voted that they wanted amputation of the thieves of the hand, he said it's against human rights. But of the 30 articles, I don't see the right to have a hand as one of them. Actually, the right to have a vote was one of them, and the right for a state to be sovereign is another one. So here you have clear contradictions between human rights, which is what my esteemed interlocutor is not telling us. That these human rights, which are predicated on axiomatic, unprovable first premises, are actually human rights which are outgrowth of liberalism and which have no proof, as we've seen today. Moreover, they contradict each other. Sovereignty of state versus democracy versus life versus... This is why I asked him the question. Because if you say, well, even if 99% of the population they want amputation of hands of thieves, we're not going to have it. This is in fact going against the human right of democracy. So you can't have your cake and eat it both. It's going to be a contradiction, I'm afraid. You're going to have to endure that contradiction.
One old practice about cutting the hand if you're a thief. Yeah. Wouldn't you think that that person would be labeled and recognized by everybody in the society the rest of their lives, that they maybe once was a thief? Isn't that a very cruel thing, that you never are ready with your punishment? Don't you think it's cruel?
I think it is definitely, it's not nice to watch, but that's the whole point. Some things need to be cruel. You need to be cruel to be fair sometimes. The point is this, is that first and foremost, is it always applicable? I think that's the first question. It's not always applicable that someone has to have their hand amputated. But I think the system of ethics of Islam is different to the system of ethics of liberalism. So liberalism assumes that we own our bodies. And by the way, that's another thing you cannot prove. By the way, you cannot prove logically or metaphysically that you own your own body. You cannot prove that. It's impossible to prove on first principles. Let alone your children, which some have stated actually in the literature. However, when we say this, that there are some deterrents, which are, for example, cutting the hand off the thief and so on, which can apply sometimes in certain situations, we're admitting that this is something which is not. And the Quran actually says, when it talks about the hadd al-zina, it says, وَلَا تَأْخُذْكُمْ بِهِمَا رَأْفَةٌ فِي دِينِ اللَّهِ إِن كُنْتُمْ تُؤْمِنُونَ بِاللَّهِ وَالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ. In chapter 24, verse number 2. It says, when you're applying the punishment, don't have compassion in your heart when you're applying the punishment. Meaning, there's a natural inclination to feel like this is a bit much, it's a bit, However, Allah is saying, despite this, carry out the punishment. And the reason why is because it has a deterrent effect. Now, if you look at, for example, the death penalty in states where it's actually implemented in the United States, for example, and compare it to states where there is not implementation of it, murder rates are much higher in states which don't implement the death penalty. That's a fact. Reoffending rates in the UK, about 30% of people reoffend. Burglars reoffend, 30%. That's 1 in 3 people in prison are going to come out and do it again. So the whole point of, cutting the hand off, it reduces reoffending rate. It's very effective. It's scary, especially if people are watching it. This instills fear in the people's minds. We have a problem in London. People are being stabbed. We have 30,000 stabbings a year. And because the gang members that are stabbing, they don't care about the risk of going to prison. That's the bottom line. The fear is not there in their hearts. If you don't have fear for authority, like Emil Durkheim would say, then you can do whatever you want. So the point is, it has an intentional deterrent effect. Now, arguing, as Lars Gule has said, going against human rights are wrong because you have human rights. That is a circular argument. That's exactly what he said. He said it's wrong because you have, it's wrong to go against human rights because you have human rights. But how do you prove you have human rights? The way you've described them. This is the problem in this debate, that you cannot prove your first premises. Therefore, there's no way of disproving this kind of thing. Thank you.